By all accounts, the 2020 election will be the most expensive in history.
Did you get a lot of political fundraising texts in the last election?
I did.
It was nonstop.
A bunch.
I probably got like 60 texts a day.
Did any of them work? Did you end up donating as a result?
No.
At first glance, the United States appears to be a democracy. Citizens vote, laws are passed through elected representatives, and politicians claim to act on behalf of the public.
The golden age of America begins right now.
But if you dig a little deeper, a very different picture emerges. One where corporations, often quietly and systematically, shape policy, influence elections, and decide outcomes that affect millions of lives. In other words, much of American politics is not about public choice. It's about private power. This isn't some conspiracy theory. It's a documented pattern of influence, codified in laws, court decisions, and lobbying practices. And it has profound consequences for inequality, economic policy, environmental protection, and the very functioning of democracy itself. To understand how corporations quietly dominate politics, we need to start with money. Specifically, the way campaigns are funded. In the United States, running for federal office is expensive. A single competitive House race can cost millions of dollars. A Senate race can easily run into tens of millions. Presidential campaigns often exceed $1 billion. Now, most individual citizens simply can't contribute enough to make a meaningful impact, which leaves corporations, wealthy individuals, and political action committees, the so-called PACs, as the primary source of funding. Money buys access. When a candidate relies on corporate donors to fund a campaign, those donors are not invisible bystanders. They're stakeholders. They gain meetings, influence over policy proposals, and the ability to shape legislation before it even reaches a vote. This isn't theoretical. Studies show that the policy positions of elected officials often align closely with the preferences of their largest donors, sometimes even against the preferences of their constituents. In practice, the more money a corporation contributes, the louder its voice in the democratic process. The Supreme Court made this dynamic even more powerful with the 2010 Citizens United decision. In a 5-4 ruling, the court declared that corporations and unions have the same free speech rights as individuals, allowing them to spend unlimited sums on political advertising. The effect was dramatic. Suddenly, corporations could pour massive amounts of money into campaigns, super PACs, and advocacy groups, shaping narratives, influencing elections, and intimidating opposition. The decision effectively legalized corporate lobbying at a scale previously impossible, transforming elections into arenas dominated by private wealth. But money is only the beginning. Corporations influence politics through lobbying, a direct and highly effective form of policy shaping. Lobbyists are professionals who know how to navigate legislative systems, craft bills, and sway lawmakers. According to data from the Center for Responsive Politics, corporations and related interest groups spend billions of dollars every year lobbying Congress. And this lobbying isn't evenly distributed across industries. Highly profitable sectors, like finance, pharmaceuticals, and fossil fuels, spend far more than less profitable or less politically connected industries. The result? Policy tends to favor those who can pay for influence, not those who need it. Now, lobbying isn't just about writing laws. It's also about shaping public perception. Corporations fund think tanks, advocacy groups, and media campaigns that frame political debates in ways favorable to their interests. A fossil fuel company may not be able to stop climate science, but it can fund campaigns that sow doubt, delay regulation, and protect profits. A pharmaceutical giant may not control public health research, but it can lobby to prevent price controls and extend patents. Over time, these actions create a system where public debate is filtered through corporate priorities. Corporate influence also extends to regulatory agencies. Agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, or the Securities and Exchange Commission are supposed to regulate industries for the public good. But corporations often ensure that these agencies are staffed with former executives, industry consultants, or lobbyists, a practice known as the revolving door. When the regulators have deep ties to the industries they oversee, rules often favor corporate interests. Enforcement is weaker, penalties are lighter, and oversight becomes predictable rather than impartial. The consequences of corporate domination are visible across policy domains. Environmental regulation is one of the clearest examples. Despite decades of evidence showing the harm caused by pollution, climate change, and habit destruction, meaningful regulation has often been delayed or weakened. Why? Because corporations have the financial resources to lobby, litigate, and influence public opinion in ways that preserve their profits. Fossil fuel companies, agribusinesses, and chemical manufacturers have repeatedly slowed or blocked legislation aimed at protecting the environment, even when the scientific consensus is very clear. Economic policy follows a similar pattern. Tax breaks for corporations, deregulation of finance, and trade policies that benefit multinational companies are all examples of how corporate influence shapes lawmaking. Meanwhile, policies that would benefit the average citizen, like raising the minimum wage, expanding healthcare, or regulating predatory lending,
19 states, including Virginia, will raise their minimum wage in the new year. California, New York, Michigan are other states set to increase payments on January 1st.
Face fierce opposition and slower legislative progress. Corporate influence doesn't just tilt the scales, it defines them. Corporations also manipulate the legal system to maintain their dominance. Through strategic litigation, lobbying for favorable court decisions, and funding political candidates who appoint sympathetic judges, companies create a legal environment that protects their interests. The Citizens United decision is one of many examples. Others include cases that limit class action lawsuits, weaken labor protections, or protect intellectual property in ways that prevent competition. Over time, the law itself becomes an instrument of corporate power. One of the most insidious effects of corporate control is its impact on voter influence. When citizens realize that elections are dominated by corporate money, their sense of political efficacy declines. People feel that no matter how they vote, the system is stacked against them. Lower political participation amongst average citizens reinforces corporate dominance. In essence, corporate influence undermines the democratic principle of equal representation. Money becomes power, and power trumps the ballot. But this isn't just a US phenomenon. Corporations influence politics around the world. Global companies use lobbying, campaign funding, regulatory capture, and media influence to shape policies in multiple countries simultaneously. But the United States is a particularly stark case because of the size of its economy, the dominance of corporate lobbying, and unique legal protections for corporate speech. Some critics argue that corporations are just responding to incentives. If the system allows influence through money, why shouldn't corporations participate? That argument is technically correct, but it misses the broader societal consequences. When corporate influence dominates policy, the democratic ideal is undermined. Laws no longer reflect the collective will of the people, but instead the narrow interests of the wealthy and powerful. In other words, democracy becomes a facade, while real power resides behind closed doors in corporate boardrooms. There are also structural factors that exacerbate corporate influence. Lobbying is easier when political systems are complex and opaque. Citizens rarely have the expertise or even access to counteract corporate strategies. Campaign finance laws, voter registration rules, and districting practices all affect who has a voice and whose interests are heard. The combination of money, organization, and access makes corporations uniquely effective players in the political system. Some reforms are often suggested to counteract corporate power. Public financing of campaigns, stricter lobbying restrictions, transparency rules, and limits on corporate contributions are commonly discussed. Others advocate for systemic changes, like ranked choice voting, independent redistricting commissions, or restructuring campaign finance laws to reduce the influence of money in politics. Each reform faces enormous political resistance, in part because the entities that benefit most from the current system, the corporations themselves, have the resources to block change. Even so, there are signs that public awareness is increasing. Grassroots movements, citizen-led advocacy, investigative journalism, and social media campaigns have begun to expose corporate influence in ways that were previously invisible. Campaigns for clean energy, financial reform, healthcare access, and labor rights are increasingly framed as efforts to wrest power away from corporate interests and return it to the public sphere. These movements highlight one of the most important lessons about corporate influence. It is not inevitable. It is a product of choices, laws, and systems, and those systems can be changed. Understanding the subtle ways that corporations shape policy is essential for anyone who cares about democracy, inequality, and public welfare. Corporate dominance is rarely obvious because it operates quietly through campaign contributions, lobbying, regulatory capture, and media influence. It is systemic, diffuse, and often legal, but it isn't natural. It's the result of a series of institutional arrangements that favor wealth and power over the collective good. The question we face as citizens is whether we want to accept a political system where corporate influence is the default, or whether we want to create a system where democracy actually works as intended. That means asking some hard questions. How should elections be funded? How should lobbying be regulated? How how do we prevent regulatory capture? How do we ensure that the policy decisions reflect the interests of the public rather than the few? The reality is uncomfortable. Corporate influence isn't just a problem for politicians or policymakers, it affects everyone. It shapes the food we eat, the air we breathe, the healthcare we receive, and the taxes we pay, plus the laws that govern our daily lives. Yet most people barely notice, because the process is hidden behind legal and procedural technicalities. Exposing these systems is just the first step toward reclaiming democracy. By understanding the mechanisms of corporate control, campaign contributions, lobbying, regulatory capture, judicial influence, we can begin to imagine reforms that restore public accountability. By demanding transparency, fighting for campaign finance reform, and participating in civic life, citizens can counterbalance corporate power. No, it won't be easy, and it definitely won't be quick. But it is possible. Ultimately, the story of corporate influence in American politics is a story about power. It's about how money, organization, and legal protections allow private interests to shape public policy in ways that few citizens can control. But it's also a story about opportunity. The opportunity for citizens to recognize that power, to understand it, and to reclaim it. Democracy only works when the public actively participates and holds institutions accountable. When corporations dominate, democracy falters. But when citizens insist on transparency, fairness, and accountability, the system can be corrected. If you want to understand American politics today, don't just follow elections or party rhetoric. Look at the money, look at lobbying, look at regulatory decisions, campaign donations, and corporate influence. That is where much of the real power lies. And if you want to change the system, start there too. Because democracy isn't just a spectator sport, and the quiet takeover by corporations proves that if you don't pay attention, someone else will write the rules. And those rules often serve profit over people.